Welcome to the PowerPoint module for the week of October 5th. This week we're going to be discussing sex and gender as determinants of health. And we could spend many weeks on this topic. Unfortunately, we only have 1 week. We will talk about the difference between sex and gender, also consider how gender operates on multiple levels societally to shape health and health disparities. But I do, I consider this to be a topic that is very near and dear to me and my own research. So I'm very excited to be talking about this topic with all of you. Our objectives for this week are first to distinguish between sex and gender in relation to health. We're going to talk about masculinity in connection to health, and then also consider how disparities in heart attack deaths are shaped by both sex and gender. I do expect that this module will take about an hour. Might take a little bit less because there are fewer slides, but up to an hour. Your deliverables for this week are first, as usual, to have your reading question done by Monday night, your PowerPoint module done by Tuesday night, and then you don't have any assignments due this Friday. All right, so it's just the reading question, the module, and coming to class. Instead of completing an opening question for this week, I'm asking that you complete a mid-semester check-in, which is a questionnaire already posted on Inquire. So you can pause here, respond to that questionnaire, and then come back. I will tell you before you pause that the questionnaire has a few questions on the PowerPoint modules themselves, on Zoom sessions, and then for those of you who have started meeting in class, I'm asking a couple of questions on in-class sessions as well. I know we've only had 2, so might not have a ton of feedback at this point, but I do really appreciate getting some feedback and discussion on how class is going, especially during a semester like this. So now you can pause, answer those questionnaire questions, and come back. I want to start by introducing a little bit of sociology in connection to sex and gender. And this probably isn't going to be a new idea or concept for many of you because the distinction between sex and gender and what we mean by gender in particular, this has gotten a lot of broader attention over the past decade or so, which is great. But I do want to go through this really quickly just so that we have a basic vocabulary to build on when we talk about sex, gender, and health. First, sex. When you think about a person's sex, you probably automatically jump to thoughts about biology, physiology, genetics, chromosomes, and we do typically use genitals, secondary sex characteristics, hormones, and or chromosomes to classify people by sex. So classically, I think when I first learned about the distinction between sex and gender, I learned sex is biology and gender is social. Now, this isn't entirely true. There is a major caveat here. When we talk about sex, we use biological criteria. So those things I just listed, genitals, secondary sex characteristics, hormones, chromosomes, we use these to classify people by sex. And we do have finite categories that we use: male, female, and intersex, which is a category for those who do not have typically genitalia who fit neatly into our male or female binary. Now, I do want to say, and we can certainly talk more about this in class, that these categories that we use, even if they're based on biological criteria, they are socially constructed. And we see this especially when we talk about intersex and intersex people and how there is pressure among parents, especially after the birth of an intersex child, to perform unnecessary surgeries in order to fit that child into the male-female binary. We can talk a lot more about this in class because this is a significant public health issue and it is a social determinant of health for a lot of people, this idea of needing to fit within a sex binary. I'm digressing a little bit because this is a very important topic. If we had more weeks, we'd talk a lot more about it. But sex, typically we're thinking about physiology and genetics. Though the categories that we assign people into sexes is actually a social process. Second is gender. And gender, I'm defining this as broadly as possible. Gender is a social system. When we think about gender, you probably think about gender identity, so how somebody identifies with their gender. Also gender expression, how somebody expresses themselves femininely or masculinely, or androgynous, somewhere in between. Gender expression and in some ways gender identity is a continuum. I want to spend a lot of time this week talking about gender as a social stratification system. That is, we see inequalities in economic opportunity, political representation, educational opportunity, to name a few, by gender. And this is a social process. It is not based on inherent biological differences by gender. It is based on our social structures and our opportunity structures. And this has significant implications for health. This is using a social determinants of health frame to understand the relationship between gender and health. To elaborate on this idea of gender as a social system, I pasted this figure from the Holman article that you had for this week, which I know is a long and rather involved article, but it is also a very novel way of thinking about gender and health. And that's why I assigned this to you this week. I know the print is pretty small here, so hopefully you can see this on the YouTube video. If not, this is coming right from the reading that you did for this week. Holman classifies or considers gender to be a social system. And by this, she means that we have multiple levels in our society. We have our macro level institutions. So these are cultural norms, these are distributions of resources. By institutions, we might be thinking about politics, our political system, our education system, the labor force, religion. I mean, there are so many social institutions that exist, and we do see stratification or inequality by gender within these institutions. We can also consider interactions with others, patterns of behavior, how we are socialized to behave in gendered ways. These interactions with others and, say, within our jobs or within our schooling, within our families, these interactions also have implications for health. So this is what she calls the meso level or the middle level. And then finally, at the micro level, we have individuals. And these are our gendered selves, right? As I said before, we are socialized to practice certain behaviors, but also to adopt a certain gender identity. We have internalized expectations about gendered behavior and gender ideology. So all of these are very interconnected with health. And this is what Holman calls structural sexism, how sexism operates at the institutional level, at the interactional level, and at the individual level to shape health. This is different from sexist behaviors by individuals. So somebody treating you poorly on the basis of gender. Certainly, this is a significant issue, and this does have public health implications. But when Holman is talking about gender in this article, she's really talking about gender as a structural system. She's talking about it sociologically. Now, rather than talk at you more about the health implications of gender or how gender identity, behavior, our structured gender system, how all of these shape health, I just want you to consider what you read for this week and consider the ways in which gender shapes health. You read the Courtenay article, which was talking about masculinity. You read the Holman article, which was focused on structural sexism. And also the article on the WISE study related to cardiovascular disease. So based on one, two, or all of these readings, consider the ways in which gender shapes health. consider both gendered behaviors and the existence of structural inequalities by gender. You're not going to have an exhaustive list or account here. You could write a book series on this, but I do want you to at least write a paragraph describing or responding to this question. We're going to talk a lot more about really the question that you responded to in the previous slide when we're in class. Right now, I want to zoom in on a specific example to show us how both sex and gender operate to shape health disparities. And this is the example of women and coronary artery disease. This figure is it's a recent update from the American Heart Association, and this is showing trends in the total annual number of deaths caused by cardiovascular disease by gender. And we see women or females in red, and we see males in blue. And what you see across time is that the death rate for males had been declining, right? Declining from the 80s up until around 2010, and we do start to see a jump back up at 2010. Whereas women, we see a very different pattern. We see pretty steadily, steady numbers on deaths from 1980. We see a little bit of a drop around 1990, and then we see another spike in the late 90s, early 2000s, followed by a decline. So there clearly is a pattern here. And it's not a pattern that is, solely biological, right? Because we see a lot of change across time. So there must be something social going on here as well to explain why we see differences in the death rates by gender for coronary artery disease. This is a good example that we can use to apply both sex and gender to understand inequalities in health. And I'm going to have you do that watching a video that's introduced in the next slide. Here's your video question that's based on the disparities that I introduced to you in the previous slide in cardiovascular disease mortality. I want you to watch a TED Talk by Noelle Berry-Meyers. She is actually, I think she still is, the director of the Women's Health Initiative, specifically focusing on cardiovascular disease. I want you to watch this TED Talk. She's going to talk about sex, gender, and disparities in mortality from cardiovascular disease. Answer the following question once you watch this TED Talk. How do differences in heart attack mortality described in the video relate to sex differences? How do they relate to gender inequality? Right? And it actually is some overlap of both sex and gender that we see here to shape the disparities in cardiovascular disease mortality. All right, so you can pause here, respond to that video question, and that's the last thing you have to do for this PowerPoint module. There's just one slide left on class for this week. For this week, we're going to do the same thing we've done past couple weeks. We're going to have our in-class group meet on Wednesday, our Zoom group meet on Friday, and we're going to discuss a few things. I do want to talk about masculinity in health, specifically the Courtenay article. I think this was an interesting one in thinking about how gender expression is related to health, and then also talk about structural sexism as described by Homan and how this is related to health as well. So please come prepared to discuss these topics.